So I would like to welcome everybody for joining this month's Forest and Climate Learning Exchange series. On the screen, you can see some of our upcoming webinars. Just noting that our January one had to be postponed for personal reasons, and we're going to try to maybe reschedule that for May or June, so be on the lookout for that. My name is Dr. Chad Papa. I'm the director of the Forest Carbon and Climate Program here at Michigan State University. And before we hand it off to our speakers today, I would like to thank our co-host for the 2025-26 Forest and Climate Learning Exchange Series, the Society of American Foresters. SAF is a national scientific and educational organization representing forestry and related natural resource professionals across the United States. Founded in 1900, SAF promotes science-based, sustainable management and stewardship of our nation's public and private forests. Our next webinar coming up in March, on March 4th, is going to be given by Dr. Kurt Kippmuller, who is recently appointed as the 1855 Professor of Indigenous and Tribal Natural Resource Management in the Department of Forestry at Michigan State University, and also holds a joint appointment in the Residential College of Art and Humanities. His talk titled Using Stories from Tree Rings to Better Understand Fire, Climate, and People Relationships in the Upper Great Lakes will explore how tree rings are important sources of information for understanding environmental changes, since their growth patterns are influenced by the variation in their surrounding environment. This presentation will explore how tree rings encoded in the trees can be used to better understand how fire shapes forests in the Great Lakes and how that's been directly influenced by indigenous stewardship. Before we get started, I also want to cover some bit of housekeeping. At the end of the presentation, participants will have the opportunity to ask questions. There are two ways you can go about doing that. You can either click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and submit questions at any point during the webinar. Also, feel free to message the host and panelists directly in the chat function, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as time allows. On top of that, on the right side of the screen, you'll see a QR code that'll take you to our mailing list if you want to stay up to date on forest, carbon, and climate news and find out about new and exciting events that are coming throughout the year. Lastly, participants of this webinar have the opportunity to earn continuing education credits through the Society of American Foresters. If you registered for this webinar using the same email as your SAF account, the credits will automatically be applied to your account. However, if you registered with a different email than your SAF account, please email cf@safnet.org and let them know that you participated in this webinar but used a different email account. And so with that, I would like to welcome our guest speakers this week. Matt and Hannah, both from the Great Plains Institute, will be giving their talk, The Reforestation Pipeline, Challenges to Nurseries and Seedlings. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and now hand it off to Hannah and Matt.
Sounds good. Thank you, Chad. Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Matt, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself real fast
Sure
before I take it
thing.
off?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Creasy. I'm the Natural and Working Lands Analyst on the team at Great Plains Institute. My work primarily revolves around modeling and data analysis to support our forestry and agriculture decarbonization work that supports policy, among other things. So I'll toss it back to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Matt. My name is Hannah Haas. I'm the Natural and Working Land Specialist, work really closely with Matt, but my background is in more the social sciences. So we've got a nice, well-balanced team to work on our policy and research. And what we are talking about today is our tree planting pipeline, challenges to nurseries and seedlings, and then our approach as to how to kind of ease those pinch points in the pipeline. And first here, we'll do just a little overview of what we'll do. So we'll introduce ourselves because what does the Great Plains Institute have to do with tree planting? We'll explain. What we've seen with state tree planting goals, what we've seen by way of pinch points in the supply chain, and then again, our approach to how to ease those pinch points. So starting off with the Great Plains Institute, we are a nonprofit that is based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Our mission is to accelerate the transition to net zero carbon emissions for the benefit of people, the economy, and the environment. Historically, when we first started, we were based in the Midwest, thus our name. But as our organization has grown, we have also grown to now cover the entire US. Our programs work across the major emission sectors, and many of our programs work across, like touch on multiple of these emission sectors. Matt and I focus primarily on ag and forestry. GPI has a twofold approach to change. So we help states, cities, tribal nations, utilities, and others develop and implement their clean energy and climate plans. And at the same time, we also work to create the system conditions necessary for those changes to be implemented, and then for any promising low, zero, and carbon negative technologies to scale up quickly. And so that looks at changes in policy, practices, regulation, etc. We do a number of things. We do applied research and analysis. We are big on facilitation and stakeholder engagement. And then we build advocacy around multi-interest consensus. We provide expert technical assistance and then also communications, network building, and knowledge sharing. And so as part of especially our facilitation and stakeholder and communications networking and knowledge sharing, we have been engaging with states for the past 3 years on climate action plans. And we'll get into that and how it has to do with the tree planting goals in just a hot second here. So we have been part of a group called the Conveners Network that is a bunch of conveners that have put together this initiative called the States Deployment Initiative. And it was originally intended to help states create and update climate action plans to go with the EPA's Climate Action Pollution Reduction Grant. And so for those who are unfamiliar, that grant through the EPA under the Biden administration did give states dollars to create or update climate action plans and then also to implement those climate action plans. And so we provided a facilitated forum where states could learn from each other, talk across political differences, talk with other states who are in similar political landscapes, and raise questions and issues and benefit from technical and expert assistance. Matt and I facilitated the natural working lands work stream of this. And so we worked with states on what measures, how to measure, anything related to natural and working lands that would go into a climate action plan. There was a big emphasis throughout this entire process on multi-state collaboration, and that is something that we want to also continue forward into this new work around the supply chain. And what we noticed when folks were bringing their climate action plans or updating their climate action plans was that tree planting initiatives are a very popular measure for states to take when it comes to decarbonization. It doesn't matter what the political landscape of the state is, it's fairly easy and approachable and palatable for states to do. And so 34 states and Puerto Rico included tree planting goals in their climate action plans. And those could relate to reforestation, afforestation, restoration, or urban canopy expansion. Of those 34 states, 5 states also included a goal to support or expand their seed banks and tree nurseries. But just to give you an idea of the scope and the size of a lot of these, I just grabbed a couple from across the nation. We've got a range from like Virginia, who has a tree planting goal of 600,000 trees, to Wisconsin that has 100 million trees by 2030. California has a massive tree planting goal of 4.2 million plus. So we've got a lot across the nation, and that's just at the state level, let alone the local level. And as I just mentioned, only 5 states also mentioned the fact that they will need to expand and support their nurseries. And so we've kind of identified this problem along with our partners that there are not enough seeds and seedlings to meet the projected tree planting goals that states have laid out in their climate action plan. And so I'm going to hand things over to Matt, who will take us through the supply chain side.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I'll be going over a little bit of the specifics here. We had these conversations with state partners who were interested in increasing their tree planting goals and incorporating those into climate action planning. And something that we quickly realized was we can have these conversations, but we needed a better understanding of the economic conditions that facilitate the challenges. So we looked to our partners at New Leaf Climate, and I'll have 3 slides from them to present on that, beginning with kind of the academic consensus here that there is a challenge to begin with. We can see that there's kind of an obvious time differentiator here. Prior to 2020, we had a few different academic research publications that kind of portend the need for it currently as of the last 5 years, roughly. And you see that we have a lot of different publications on different specific subjects, also including organizations that produce these, which are include American Forests and Arbor Day. But there's a wide variety of challenges that kind of make this a really sticky situation to walk into. So there are generally, there's a look at the lack of diversity in production available. There's not enough types of trees for the types of activities that we're talking to states about. There's an aging workforce component. This also figures into a smaller mom and pop establishment industry wherein, those who are running or owning that particular business are looking to retire and are wanting to pass the business off. There's a general recession of state nurseries that has been happening over the last 10 years or so plus. And then there's the obvious distinction between kind of the industrial production and the mom and pop industrial production. So we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that, but you can see that we have a lot of consensus moving into today as we look at the challenges. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about this particular assessment of seedling demand. Obviously, there's 2 sides to this particular graph right here. We have our restoration pipeline, or the real world scenario, which is going to drive our potential demand for seedlings, right? We have things and projects that need to be completed in order for those acres to be considered reforested or afforested. So at the top, we have our timber supply chain, specifically as it relates to seedlings, and that's going to be a commercial tree demand that is strongest in the Southeast. So we're not going to dwell too much on the actual the timber piece of this specifically, but that is an important and very oversized portion of all annual seedling demand throughout the country. So we'll see that in agroforestry, which is the integration of trees and shrubs onto working agriculture, mostly predominant in our plains and Midwest regions. There's an active year-over-year demand, met demand of 2.6 million acres and potential of almost 25 million acres. So you see that New Leaf has done the work here to consolidate the regional demands based on industry and present them here and show that as we move through these, including wildfire, which is most present in California, the West Coast and Intermountain West, there's a huge reforestation backlog as we move forward year over year. The last 2 categories here, policy is typically driven by the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, which they've identified as 60% of this policy-driven tree planting. And this also includes conservation easement-related activities that promote forest stewardship, and other activities. So these acres that we see as potential demand, on the right side, we'll see that we have all those numbers in terms of 1.8 million seedlings for timberland and agroforestry and wildfire below. But you'll see here that while our markets, carbon ARR or afforestation, reforestation, revegetation is only 150,000 acres, the carbon credit or market demand for that is quite low overall. So that's our real world demand. And if we look at the next slide, please, we'll see the annualized seedling demand at around 2.6 billion seedlings, and as compared to the current supply of 1.5 billion seedlings. So this is what we talk about when we talk about a 1 billion seedling deficit. So this is obviously quite large, and orders of magnitude larger than a production facilities such as USFS Coeur d'Alene site, which, or the total production of all independent nurseries. But we see in the existing supply of seedlings that are trying to meet that demand, industrial covers the largest portion of that, but the private independent nurseries hold a large piece in addition to the public. So we will kind of dive more into that state level economy on the next slide, please. Thank you. So we understand that nursery landscapes are vastly differing from state to state, and neighboring states will typically have somewhat of a closed ecosystem. In the Midwest, it can be a little more regional, and that's something that we're trying to understand. But a common trend across the country will include the recession of these state-operated nurseries. This is something that we've talked to partners about and seen as market conditions have left these state nurseries kind of in disrepair or otherwise underfunded. We know that there's a segment of the private industry that will step in to kind of meet that demand for projects and other restoration. So this leads to our last bullet here. There's no one size fits all approach. There's a few different models, since there's, typically in any state, sliding scale of public versus private involvement in terms of supplying trees for larger restoration. In terms of Oregon, they recently, the Department of Forestry, for post-fire restoration, submitted grants of 200 to 500,000 to nurseries across the state. That was to increase capacity for infrastructure and improvements, as well as seed collection. So that's one example of a state going out of their way to increase capacity there, kind of on its own. In New York, we see a kind of a different approach. TNC chose 2 different nurseries through a grant application process, from which those specific nurseries were given a grant of around $300,000 a piece to complete work and infrastructure repairs and meet that demand, as well as a 2-year contract for procurement purchases in the future. So those are 2 kind of different approaches to funding mechanisms that are available at different state economy markets for seedlings. And we also see in Minnesota the outsized impact of nursery closures. The C.C. Andrews nursery closed in 2013, and there was a marked decline in seedling production after that. However, it was more precipitous after the Diplodia outbreak in 2016 to 2018, and then even beyond that, as we move into our post-2020 environment, we see that seedling production has decreased even further. So I'll talk about one more example of state level nurseries on the next slide, and then we'll move forward to what we're doing about it. So in Colorado, the state nursery, the Colorado State Forest Service nursery, has been somewhat underfunded and understaffed over the last however many years. However, the legislature has, in the last few years, decided to mark funding for infrastructure improvements in addition to workforce. So in 2022, $5 million in funding was dedicated to the nursery, and the next year, an additional 5.3 million was promised. I believe they have, as of this past year, hired for a nursery manager since that position was unfilled for some amount of time. However, it's important to note that in Colorado's specific landscape, there's a demand to be met for large scale orders, typically that are related to post-fire restoration, with typically the Forest Service being involved in those contracts. So in the interim, while the Colorado State Nursery was struggling to keep up with that, a few private corporations stepped into that void, typically overlapping in the labor and workforce area as well. And we kind of see this as a good example of a state's seedling economy moving forward, right? There is both an existing private industrial complex that produces seedlings that has stepped up in the absence of state nursery seedling production, but one does not preclude the other here. There's a need for both to meet the kind of outsized demand that we talked about previously in the last couple of slides. So next slide, please. So looking at all of these different state level landscapes and understanding that there is a large deficit that exists across the state desire to meet those plantings and tree planting goals, we have our seedling and nursery collaborative. Next slide, please. Our aim for this goal, as we work with our partners, is to understand those pinch points through our private-public partnership approach. And we've decided that this is the best way to approach this due to the federal recession of involvement, specifically in terms of both seedling production and a seat at the table when it comes to these large projects. So while we understand that there is less of a federal involvement, it's important that states have these projects and goals that they want to meet, and they need everyone at the table in order to determine how supply can be raised and sustainably alongside the demand. So we're looking to work at the collaborative level to facilitate that knowledge share, both within the state and then across state lines in a regional partnership. You know, these economies are not closed; they are influenced by one another and typically can help to fill in the gaps. So we're going to work towards a regional partnership, and we also want to take the time to understand that state level environment specifically in order to give the best assistance as possible so we can address those obstacles further in the tree planting supply. Next slide, please. To that end, we have 4 collaborative goals. As I mentioned previously, we want to develop a replicable model for public-private partnership to increase seed bank and nursery capacity at the state level, and we believe that this is a worthwhile endeavor such that we can take what we've learned from one state, see what works the best, and kind of create a more flexible solution to be applied to other states so that we can all learn and continue to develop those regional markets together. Our second collaborative goal would be to develop our best practices and policy recommendations. We know that even states that haven't specifically pointed out a number on tree planting goals, be that acres or seedling production or trees planted, typically have some interest in nurseries or providing trees or providing some support to private landowners. So by providing those policy recommendations and best practices, we can lend some level of specificity to states that want to have that and help other states that have already outline that specificity to enact that, right? Our third goal is to facilitate a network of states with tree planting goals. This would include, states that are neighboring or otherwise in the same market seedling markets together such that there's increased transparency and collaboration between actors to work towards those reforestation goals in a collaborative way. And our fourth goal, which we haven't touched too much upon, is the workforce development piece of that. We've talked about an aging workforce, which is somewhat of an evergreen issue when it comes to forestry workforce issues specifically. But we want to support that both professionally and volunteer, since there's kind of an informal workforce that works towards seed collection in some states and is a vital part of that specific supply chain. So those are our collaborative goals. Next slide, please. And we want to define success on a few factors here. So we look at holding successful and really productive regional meetings for our partners and stakeholders. We want to be able to walk away from those meetings and convenings with clear, independent research questions in order to then carry those out and perform analysis so we can continue to advise on the seedling supply chain. We would like to continue on this financial markets piece that New Leaf Climate has put together and build on that to address risk management, investment capital, and continue to advise on workforce issues as states are keenly aware that a lot of local economies are dependent upon those for maintenance of the industry, and also work through our policy recommendations with white papers and stakeholder engagement. We believe that our approach to this particular issue is somewhat novel in that we understand there's a regional collaborative approach, but we are looking at that kind of state level focused first. We're prioritizing understanding all of the public and private levels of actors that go into this kind of patchwork industry that we're committed to helping in order to inform our restoration activities. So understanding at the state level is going to be imperative to our regional seedling supply and demand and growing those both co-equally. And we know that increasing transparency is a two-way street, right? State governments have goals, but being able to communicate those to suppliers that are not necessarily state-run is going to be really key for moving the dial in terms of increasing that production and getting those unmet restoration demands to be met. And we know that this one state approach is a scalable process that we think will prioritize in-person knowledge share, convenings, and hopefully create research products that will not only benefit the state, but other states as well in the process.
I'll step in here with just a couple of slides on what we've done so far and where we're going with our work. So we have convened some state officials and held initial discussions around a couple of topics. This is not an exhaustive list, but we've talked to states about their climate and forest planning goals, the roles of states in expanding nursery capacity and seedling capacity. We've talked about financial, legislative, and policy barriers. We've talked about the nursery production cycles and how it relates to demand. So noting that sometimes to produce a seedling from seed to a seedling ready to go, ready to be shipped takes a year and a half. And so the nursery then needs to be able to predict demand, and sometimes they do that well, and sometimes they don't. And what ways could states potentially step in to help ease that process? We've touched on communication gaps that happen between state agencies within a state. We potentially have our climate planning offices setting a tree planting goal, but not talking to the Department of Ag or DNR or Forestry at all about what that looks like, or if there is enough within the state nursery to meet those demands. And then, as Matt has already mentioned, that gap between the private and public entities, that communication gap. And the workforce challenges, that perpetual challenge in the forestry sector. And for This pipeline in particular, it ranges from, lack of seed collectors to, the need for nursery operators, both like technicians and managers, and then also on the forestry side of like the foresters who are walking the land to write the prescription, to place the order, and then also to plant the trees. So all along the supply chain, there are workforce challenges. And as we move forward, we are I'm going to just hop right to my second bullet here. So continue to convene our state level officials to continue diving into those topics and those conversations to see if we can't work our way into some solutions that are scalable and shareable across the nation. We will also be doing some research. We are working on aggregating state and local tree planting demands to understand what that demand actually is. And then we are also working on a market innovation, so highlighting practices and policies that will enable uh, a better market for seedlings and nurseries. Um, Along the way, we will also be doing state level deep dives, and all of these feed into each other. And so, like the research topics that we're diving into are fed by the state level convenings. That's the national convenings of all of the states, so that they are raising the issues. We are giving them a platform to talk to each other, to share success stories, to share challenges, to brainstorm ways of approaching solutions. And so the research will inform that. They will be informed. The research will also be um, jump-started by the state's conversations. Um, and then one of the things we are really excited about doing is the state level deep dive. So taking a couple of states and convening everyone in the that has to do with seedlings and nurseries together. So that's state officials, tribal nations, NGOs, nursery operators, restoration organizations to discuss the nursery supply chain within one state. And the research that we want to do specific to that state deep dive would be the seed collection supply chain assessment, nursery stakeholder mapping and supply analysis, funding and incentive analysis, and the workforce landscape analysis for that specific state. The goal would be to do a few of these state level deep dives. So hopefully in a couple of different regions of the US, and then from there take that and create a best practices white paper of across the nation. Here are a bunch of things that we have learned about what policies and legislation and uh, financial incentives or private-public partnerships have worked to help support and expand nurseries so that states can actually meet their climate goals that they have set through these really big tree planting goals. And I'm going to hand things back to Matt for our last few slides here.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, and as we're moving forward, we just briefly want to say that we understand there's a readiness here. There's shifting ecosystems. There's climate-induced mortality, either through that, be that through disturbance, wildfire, or what have you. But we've touched on this before, but I think this necessitates that increased cooperation we've talked about between public and private entities. So we want to emphasize that's a very key piece, is that understanding. Something that we've taken away from our conversations with states is that states want to be both informed and prepared to commit to this climate action. And that's the space that we're coming from approaching this is, this is a climate planning exercise in addition to, ultimately reforestation supply chain issue. So while states, and in some cases where it's not as politically viable, there are still states that want to enact these kinds of changes and participate in these actions. So that's something to be somewhat optimistic about. And then I think those kind of takeaway from this is that climate action is not zero sum here. We can and are able to create stable markets, good jobs, and sustain local economies while also we achieve our climate goals um, through these plantings. So I think that's what we've got, and we'll move into questions.
I will add one more thing here before we hop into questions, and that is Matt and I have emphasized collaboration a lot. And we believe that we should also be collaborating with other organizations. So if you know of anyone or are an organization that would like to collaborate or know of any success stories in states that we could highlight that we should learn from, please don't hesitate to reach out. We are eager to learn and to amplify and help each other out to accomplish our goals.
All right. Thank you, Hannah and Matt, for the very nice and very informative presentation. So we have some questions now that have rolled in. So I'm going to start off with one. And what are some of the notable effects that climate change has had on nursery operations?
Shall I take this one?
That sounds great, Matt.
Um, that's a great question. I think we would have to learn more about that, just given that, in the greenhouse space, they're able to um, respond to that. I think the other piece of that is understanding that, trees are a crop, and producing a monoculture is not good in a changing climate. So part of what we're looking at too, and please correct me if I'm misinterpreting the question here, is understanding that we'll need both to anticipate species shifts and try to fulfill those looking ahead of time, and also find other species of trees that are going to be more hardy or reliant on um, different levels of precipitation or temperature or what have you. So those types of seed questions are something that we're looking into when it comes to seed banks and preparedness. Um, so that's something that people people are quite aware that that's happening and want to be prepared for that. And then the industrial production of seeds is focused on kind of like a different subsect of certain trees. So I hope that somewhat answers the question.
Kind of building off of that one. So obviously one of the challenges to tree planting is trying to get the right tree to the right place at the right time, right? And that's obviously oftentimes a multi-year process to get there. So how much of your work explores that kind of like inventory planning work for the future?
That's a great question. That is a challenge that we have identified in our work, and I think at this point we are working with states to figure out what it could look like. So I think what would help ease some pressure in the nurseries in trying to anticipate demand is working a little bit more closely with the states. And so we are definitely going to be encouraging states to think about. A lot of them, I think, have also started thinking about through their forest plans, like what trees do they want to be kind of pulling in, and then that communication to those nurseries then, so that they can prepare and make sure that they've got the right trees and the right seedlings at the right time.
Yeah, and
But
sorry,
bridging, sorry, on go, yeah, go for it, Matt.
I can build on that just a
Yeah.
little bit because the space doesn't quite allow, or at least for those smaller um, nurseries, private nurseries that are looking to provide those different types of trees, that space does not allow for that level of planning right now, like 2, 3, 4, 5 years out, because it's a year-to-year business model, and they're trying to survive, one year over the next. I think that it would be super difficult for most smaller nurseries to look out 3 years ahead when they don't even know what the demand will be for the next year. And that is part of something that we're trying to address, is that state communication is key. Like if the states are able to say to a small nursery, 3 year, this is our demand we want next year, the year after, and the year after that. That alone provides stability to these businesses that would allow them to plan in that particular way.
Could you just elaborate a bit more on what's in the scope for a state level funding and incentive analysis?
Yeah, so that would look at what funding options there are within the state of is there funding from like the state level to do replanting or restoration or tree planting? Is it is there federal funding? Or are there like business led or corporate I'm forgetting the word but corporate greening uh, projects. And then like, are there incentives for landowners? Could there be incentives for landowners? How could we better provide the financial either incentive or assistance to actually accomplish the plantings themselves? Matt, any other color you want to add there?
I think there is some element too of understanding the nursery landscape and then kind of coming out with a aggregated demand kind of product so that there's an understanding of what is both being produced and what could be produced. So there's an economic piece of that.
Have there been any kind of conversations about trying to open up reforestation and nursery management to more of kind of like a market-based approach, right? So like traditionally a lot of funding for at least at the state level is coming through like taxpayer dollars, whether it's maybe it's grants from federal sources or even like philanthropic groups or other types of like NGOs. But elsewhere in kind of the natural climate solutions space, there's lots of talk related to kind of thinking through more innovative models for conservation, with reforestation being one of those. And have you done any level of like exploration about trying to maybe access innovative markets to help fund some of this, I would say maybe misalignment of the supply and demand that we see?
That's a good question. I think I'm assuming this is kind of an allusion to carbon credit markets and that sort of thing, but I'll say that as it stands right now, that's not a huge demand driver. I mean, I think that could certainly change, but I think and kind of earlier on, I was talking about that industrial supply chain, and then there's kind of the state-driven, federal-driven demand, which kind of is two different sides of that. So I think it's an interesting question, but we're kind of looking at different funding models to bolster that mid-level private nursery um, kind of business. So Hannah, I don't know if there's more you want to add there.
Sounds good to me.
All right, a point of clarification, but what were the four states that identified expansion of seed banks and nurseries as a part of their climate action planning?
Oh man. Okay. Uh, California, Colorado, New Jersey, New York, Minnesota, I believe.
I think so.
And has there been any discussion about types of planting beyond trees? So, it could be anything for like shrubs, early cereal things. Because Matt, you did mention the acronym ARR. And for those who are not familiar, that stands for afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation. So kind of a little bit more expansive term beyond just trees.
Yeah, that's we're focused on tree nurseries. I think we're kind of looking at that because once you start to expand and kind of take more bites out of the elephant, it gets to be a different project. But I like where that is, and we earlier there's the agroforestry demand, which can include shrubby vegetation, and there's certainly an element of other plant supply chains when it comes to restoration. But I think we're just focused right now on the sapling aspect of that.
So another kind of question building on some of the maybe misalignment between state and private nurseries. So oftentimes, competition clause can preclude conversation between state and private nurseries. Has there any been discussion or planning how to overcome those restrictions?
Not yet, but that is a really important issue that we definitely should and will cover. So tune back in.
Yeah, and I'll say that obviously there's, that inherent competition, like just thinking of Colorado specifically, where some people moved from the state nursery to these other private nurseries. Um, there's emotions and history to that. So I think we want to be cognizant of that while trying to find that new path forward.
Can you provide any additional information on maybe what specific tree species have some of the highest shortfalls in relation to projected demand? And I'm sure that has like a regional focus to that as well.
Yeah, we haven't dove too much into that. The highest seedling production for, from federal and state level nurseries is going to be, I think, Oregon, Washington, Intermountain West, typically to reforest those mountain systems. And luckily, there's a few, there's, sorry, I was working a little bit overtime on that one, but there's, obviously a lot of different, there's a few shared species that I think we could focus on when it comes to between the West Coast and the Intermountain West and that wildfire restoration. Um, have we found a specific, have we decided to specifically look into that? No, we haven't. Not yet.
I'll also add from my experience working at Michigan State that we do see shortfalls in specifically hardwood species in the state of Michigan for a couple different reasons. There's been some nursery closures in the past few years, and then there's also the aspect of kind of the economic and management systems at play, where generally in hardwood stands in the Midwest US, we actually don't do a lot of tree planting. We do a lot of natural regeneration and selective cutting. And so that kind of eats into any type of demand that we might see. But as climate change has altered growing conditions, there's been a recent increase in demand for hardwood seedlings that the supply has definitely not caught up with yet. So I do think there's a very, I would say, regional focus to that question that across different ecological zones, you're going to see very different species shortfalls depending on both the needs there as well as the supply. One further question of clarification is in your analysis of future unmet seedlings, does that include demand from also private companies and private landowners? Or are those trees just count towards state level planting goals?
That does include, to my knowledge, that does include private activities, not just state level. Yeah.
And
And that report we've linked both in the chat, and then that will be followed up with.
do you have just maybe a general idea of how much the demand from private companies and private landowners contribute to this issue? Is it at like a meaningful scale? Is it less so?
Yeah, so I will say that I'm not entirely sure. Yeah. This is an assessment of nurseries specifically, so they were able to give the numbers of demand and how many seedlings were produced, and but when it comes to that finer level of aggregated who was doing the buying, that's kind of a step further.
Mhm.
All right, before we wrap up, Matt and Hannah, do you all have any last kind of comments or thoughts you might want to share with our audience?
I think we're good. Thank you so much for having us here, though, Chad.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks for
thank
the
you
great
for joining
questions.
us and presenting on this. For participants, I would like to point you to our upcoming webinars. Our next one is on March 4th, Understanding Stories from Tree Rings to Better Understand Fire, Climate, and People Relations in the Upper Great Lakes. And we have two following that in April and May. One is an overview of a forest analytics carbon tracking platform. And then finally, lessons about resilient and climate smart training and education for professionals in the southern US. If you haven't already, please join our listserv to stay up to date on news and happenings, and then also scan the bottom QR code if you want to just go directly register for the next webinar. Lastly, I will say we post the recordings and the presentations for all of our webinars to our website, which has been put in the chat. And you can go back all the way to 2017 to view any one of our webinars in our catalog. And I encourage you all to do so to see the wealth of information that is available there. And so, with that, I would like to thank our speakers again. Thank you, Matt and Hannah. And I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon.